Before the story begins, a note from Shay. Before we step into this snowy little storybook, I'd like to pause for just a moment, not to take away from the magic, but to help protect it. If you've come out tonight for a holiday stroll with your family, I'm so glad you're here. Please, if you have little ones with you, keep them close. This display may sparkle and shine like a dream, but behind the scenes, it's held together with things you might not see: sharp stakes, tiny pins, fishing line, glass pieces, and hidden wires. So I kindly ask, please do not step into the yard, and please don't touch the displays. They're delicate, and many of the pieces are quite old. You'll see the softly lit "No Trespassing" and "Stay Out" signs, along with caution tape on the edges of the yard. They aren't here to be stern, they're here to keep everyone safe, including the display itself. This magical space is watched over by a 24/7 surveillance system, not because I expect the worst, but because every single piece, every figure, light, and ornament was chosen with care and built with love. If something is ever broken by accident, and I understand that it can happen, please let me know. I'd appreciate your honesty and only ask that the piece be replaced or the damages covered, so the magic can continue for everyone who stops by after you. And if someone chooses to steal from this display, well, that won't be tolerated. All security footage will be turned over to the authorities, no questions asked. Please, just don't. Let's keep the spirit of the season shining bright, not dimmed by disappointment. This is not your average light show with flashing bulbs and inflatable snowmen. What you've just stumbled upon is something a little different, a little softer, a little older, like stepping right into the middle of a snow globe dream. This is my Hallmark movie, only no one's on TV. It's my fairy tale made real. Every mannequin, every vintage figure, every little window scene you see has been imagined, built, dressed, and placed with intention, with story, with heart. Each character has a name, each family has a backstory. Every porch, park bench, and glowing window holds a chapter of something bigger. Some will walk by quickly, and say, "Oh, how charming! Is this Halloween?" But if you stop, if you really look, you'll begin to see it. A little village, a few neighbors, a gathering of dreamers, all frozen in time, waiting to tell you their story. So please, take your time. Let the cold air pinch your nose just a bit. Listen to the quiet, let your heart slow down, and walk with me. Because this is a Christmas walk in the park on Pleasant Street, where holiday magic lingers, and where even the air feels like a memory. With warmth, wonder, and just a touch of vintage magic, Shay Mullins. Now, welcome to a Christmas walk in the park on Pleasant Street. Before there was James's Village in New York, there was California. Harold and I lived in Los Angeles in those days, a city that smelled of coal smoke and salt air, growing so fast you could hear the hammering in your sleep. My father, Paul James Getty, had carved his fortune out of the oil fields, the towering rigs rising like iron giants against the sky. He called it Getty's Oil, and it was as much a family name as our own. I grew up among ledgers and contracts, knowing the sound of a pen scratching over paper as well as the low groan of a drilling rig. Father never let me forget that business was as much about patience as it was about profit. Then came the winter he didn't see. Congestive heart failure took him swiftly, leaving Getty's Oil in the hands of its bee daughters. My sister Frankie and I sold it to Texaco, now part of Chevron, for billions. My sister Francesca Frankie Doyle and I split the inheritance, each with enough to shape our own destinies. She had her world, and I had mine, though, as you'll see, our worlds would cross again. Frankie and I were different in almost every way. From our looks, she has super curly blonde hair, and I have gray straight hair, to our temperaments. I leaned towards steady plans and building things from the ground up, while she had an instinct for grand entrances and a taste for the high circles of society. Still, we both carried our father's steel in our spines and his knack for turning opportunity into gold. Harold and I might have stayed in California, content to watch the city climb higher and louder. But one evening, over coffee in our small kitchen, we overheard a passing trader talking about land. 2,000 acres of it, for sale in upstate New York. Fertile ground, they said. Oak and pine for miles. A creek running silver even in summer. Most folks thought it too far from anything worth reaching. Harold and I thought it sounded like the edge of a dream. We bought it before the month was out and named it after my father, Paul James Getty. It became James's Village. We had a plan to build a place where people could come for a better life. We'd bring in workers, families, and dreamers. We'd give them not only jobs, but belonging. I remember the winter dusk of that first visit to our land as clearly as a pressed flower, the air clean and sharp, the frost on the grass bending under our boots, and the creek threading through the valley like a ribbon of light. We were not yet grand people. We were simply Harold and Ivy Shay Mullins, and our dream was small enough to hold in two hands, a town with light in its windows and welcome in its doorways. We're the ones who dreamed about the land, bought the land, planned the land, and built the land, plot by plot, beam by beam, brick by brick, employing working men and women. We walked the fields before the streets were even a notion, marking with stakes and chalk where homes might grow and shop fronts might flourish. We imagined not just buildings but the lives inside them, the neighbor who would wave from the porch, the baker who would know your favorite loaf, the park bench where two strangers might sit down and leave as friends. Most folks peered at the valley we found and saw only windswept fields stitched with oak and pine. But Harold stood there with his hat off and said he could already hear footsteps on cobblestones that did not exist. Neighbors greeting one another by name, a fiddle somewhere trying its best to be a choir. I believed him. My father's fortune had given us the start, but it wasn't oil or ledgers that built James's Village's soul. It was an ache in a young town to be a family. Harold laid roads and raised frames till his shoulders sang. I hammered out contracts, coaxed merchants into fair prices, and made sure that when we drew a line on paper, there was room inside it for people to live. The very first project Harold and I tackled together was ambitious, a 40-room bed and breakfast. We poured ourselves into the design, the landscaping, every small detail, right down to the scent of the linens. Country's best bed and breakfast by Ivy Shay was built. And it wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a welcome, a promise. We had chosen to build it first for a practical reason. As our employees began to arrive for future projects, we wanted them to have more than just a place to rest. We wanted them to feel welcomed, cared for, and inspired. The bed and breakfast became that haven. It was more than a building. It was our statement of hospitality, our very first mark on the world together. Then came the house, our 3-story Victorian, with nothing but windows, it seemed. It sat just to the left of the bed and breakfast, perched proudly on the hill like a watchful guardian. From there, you could see the grounds, the guests coming and going, and every carriage that rolled up the long drive. Harold liked to joke that we built the house for the view, but I knew better. I had a way of looking over the town and knowing exactly what everyone was doing, almost as if the house itself had been designed as my private lookout. On Rosie Lane, with Pleasant Street directly in front as a T. Shortly after came the Love Shack pub on the corner of Rosie Lane and Pleasant Street, then Shay's Bakery, Mullen's Diner, and Harold's A to Z Groceries, all lining Pleasant Street like pearls on a string. At the end of Pleasant Street, where it meets Central Park, we added the most beautiful park, now known as Shay's Frozen Park. From there, you can see the Statue of Liberty in the distance, a large clock tower and elegant lampposts that glow like amber in the snow. And that's where our story truly begins. As the villagers of James's Village arrive, one by one, each carrying a story of their own. Earl Evanton was one of the first men Harold and I trusted to help shape our new world. He arrived in James's Village with calloused hands and a sketchbook full of dreams, the kind of man who could see a home before a single nail was driven. For years, he worked beside us, sketching blueprints, shaping layouts, and overseeing construction across the new land. His work often carried him far from home, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months. Back in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, his wife, Chelsea, worked at the Winkler Bakery, a little brick shop where the air always smelled of cinnamon and rising dough. I remember the first time I met her. She had flour on her hands and laughter in her eyes. When Harold and I opened Shay's Bakery here in the village, we knew exactly who should run it. Earl wrote to Chelsea, telling her it was time for a new beginning, that the Mullins had built something special, and that her talents belonged among us. He went back south to help her pack up their life, every teacup and recipe card wrapped with care, and together they came east to begin again. A year after the move, Chelsea gave birth to their son, Tommy, a little bundle of light who seemed to carry the scent of sugar and bread wherever he went. But as the village grew, so did Earl's calling. Opportunity led him west again, this time to Las Vegas, Nevada, and the letters stopped coming. 2 winters passed without a single word, and still Chelsea carried on. On a snowy night, brushed in silver, I saw her walking through the park, bundled up against the cold little Tommy in her arms. His wide eyes caught each falling snowflake, as though it were a star drifting down just for him. Though her heart bore the weight of absence, she moved with quiet grace, the kind that speaks of love strong enough to wait and hope gentle enough to never fade. And in that quiet walk through the snow, Chelsea reminded us all that even when love goes missing, hope still finds its way home. Not long before the shadow of war crept across Europe, 3 sisters found their way to James's village, when William Aldrich spotted a telegram on his way to Vietnam about a new village being built in New York. His wife, Glenda, jumped at the opportunity to start a new life. Her twin sister, Brenda McCree, set off with her, the two inseparable as ever. Not long after, their sister Melinda Miles moved in with them, baby Henry in her arms. Melinda's husband, Melvin Miles, had already settled in Vietnam. Glenda and Brenda were striking, matching waves of golden hair framing faces that seemed lit by the same candle, yet their lives carried different weight. Glenda had once danced beneath string lights and mistletoe with her husband, William Aldrich, a soldier with a crooked smile and a voice that could calm any storm. They had written letters across oceans, dreaming of a house full of children. But the war took him too soon, leaving Glenda with nothing but folded uniforms and words on paper that would never be answered. Every night before she went to sleep, she would step outside, shake her fist at the sky, and shout, "I loved him first, before the war took him." Brenda, though sharing her sister's face, carried a different flame. Where Glenda turned inward, Brenda turned outward, lively, bold, and unafraid to meet the world head-on. When the Love Shack pub opened at the corner of Pleasant Street, Brenda planted her roots there as bartender, the heart of every story, every laugh, every spilled drink that kept the place alive. Glenda found steadier ground in a much quieter setting, running the front desk and checking guests in at the country's best bed and breakfast, where I placed my trust in her care. She carried her grief like a folded letter in her pocket, but the hum of voices and the steady rhythm of her work gave her strength. Melinda stayed home with baby Henry, keeping the household in perfect order, cooking, laundry, and even the yard work. It was Brenda who eventually caught the eye of Frank Doyle, not here in James's village, but miles away at a bank where he had already begun his climb to wealth and status. To most, Frank was a man of polished shoes and pressed suits, a banker with ambition written in every gesture. But to Brenda, he was simply a man who looked at her without seeing her as someone else's twin. Brenda and Frank are courting these days, and it's sweet to see. Frank, as some may remember, was once married to my sister Frankie. After their split, he left the sun-baked shores of Honolulu, Hawaii, and made his way to quiet little Renee County, a place where a man can breathe again. And that's where Brenda found him, steadying himself, ready to begin anew. The sisters remained fixtures of the place, Brenda with her laugh ringing out from the Love Shack's doorway like a bell. Glenda, her quiet presence felt in every room of the bed and breakfast, and Melinda, tending baby Henry on the porch with a watchful smile. Together, they carried every shade of life, joy and sorrow, noise and stillness, golden-haired reminders that even in the wake of loss, the village offered both refuge and belonging. So whenever you hear laughter from the Love Shack or see Glenda at the front desk, remember this. James's village didn't just give them a place to live, it gave them a place to heal. If you ever want to understand the heart of James's village, you only need to know 2 people, Edward and Margaret Ellison, I met them long before our village had roads wide enough for wagons or a church tall enough for a proper bell. Back then, it was just Harold and I, a handful of cabins, and the belief that if we were going to build a home for others, then kindness had to be the first thing planted in our soil. Edward arrived with that very idea stitched right into him. His a quiet, steady, thoughtful, and he had worked nearly 4 decades at the post office before he ever set foot on our land. He had one of those voices you trusted instantly, warm and patient, the sort that made even bad news feel like something you could shoulder. When he carried the mailbag down our path that first winter, Harold whispered, "We just gained a good man." And we had. Edward knew every family by name before most of us even knew each other. He learned every address by heart. When snow piled so high you couldn't see the fence posts, Edward still made his rounds. I once watched him wade through a drift up to his waist just to deliver a single envelope. "It matters to somebody," he told me, brushing frost from his coat. That was Edward. He never needed recognition. The act itself was enough. Margaret, now she was a different kind of magic. She had grown up surrounded by books, beautiful, worn ones, and she treated every story like a living, breathing companion. When she came to the village, she asked if she could run our little lending library in the church. The next morning, she had all the shelves alphabetized and every book dusted. People joked that Margaret didn't just remember what you borrowed, she remembered why you borrowed it. Sometimes I'd catch her slipping small handwritten notes between the pages for people she knew were going through something heavy. She never signed them. She didn't need to. The letter that brought them to us. People ask how the Ellisons ended up here, and Margaret always said it was because of a letter that traveled farther than it meant to. A simple thank you note, addressed to the kind people helping build a village of hope, was misdirected and ended up at Edward's post office miles away. When he brought it home, Margaret read it aloud at their kitchen table, and she later told me she felt something stir behind her ribs, a kind of calling. 6 months later, they arrived on our land with 2 trunks, a box of books tied in twine, and Edward's brass service bell wrapped in a scarf. They fit right in, as though they had always belonged here, as if James's village had been waiting for them. The Ellisons never had children of their own. They opened their home to 2 sisters who had been separated from their parents by tragedy, an echo of an older, crueler history, when black families were torn apart during slavery, children sold away from the arms that loved them. Without hesitation, Edward and Margaret opened their home. That was the thing about them. They didn't love loudly, but they loved completely their Christmas Eve walks. Every Christmas Eve, without fail, Edward and Margaret walked through Shay's frozen park just before the Myers started their caroling attempts. Lanterns always seemed to glow steadier when the Ellisons passed beneath them. Some folks swore the lights brightened in greeting. Margaret only smiled when we said such things, but her eyes always softened, like she believed it a little. And maybe she was right. Maybe the park did recognize the 2 people who had given so much of themselves to this place. Diane and her parents, Charles and Lillian, migrated from Greece to Salt Lake City, Utah, in 1916, when she was just 17 years old. They had been promised opportunities in America, and arrived with hopes as vast as the mountains now surrounding them. Charles soon found steady work with the Kenilworth and Helper Railway, a position that allowed the family to settle comfortably into their new life. By 1924, a new restaurant had opened in Sugar House, a suburb of Salt Lake City, the Coon Chicken Inn. Though controversial for its caricatured exterior, it became known for its fried chicken and hearty menu. Once a week, Charles, Lillian, and Diane stopped in for dinner, savoring their favorite crispy chicken. The owner, Alan, always made a point of chatting with Diane. He complimented her dresses, her smile, and the quiet confidence in the way she carried herself. Over time, their conversations lingered longer, until they eventually began courting. 3 years later, they married. For several years, Alan owned the Coon Chicken Inn with steady success, but as time passed, he began to feel the pull of something more, something quieter, something his own. When a buyer approached him with interest in taking over the restaurant, Alan saw the opportunity he had been waiting for. He sold the Coon Chicken Inn with confidence and a hopeful heart, eager for whatever came next. In 1938, their daughter Ida Rose was born. That same year, Allen spotted an ad in the New York Times. Mullen's Diner in James's Village, New York, was seeking a managing director of the diner. Knowing such a chance wouldn't last, they acted quickly. Packing their belongings, Allen, Diane, and little Ida Rose made the long journey east. Upon arriving in James's Village, a quiet, snow-dusted community, they stayed at Ivy's Bed and Breakfast, where Harold and I greeted them with warmth that felt instantly familiar. Harold carried their trunks inside, while I pressed fresh cider into their hands, saying, "You're safe here. Rest first. The village can wait." For Diane, something shifted almost immediately. The village had a softness about it, calm streets, kind neighbors, and an air of joy that seemed to float on every breeze. She felt it in the laughter echoing from Pleasant Street, in the sweet smells drifting from Shay's bakery, and in the way lanterns glowed even in broad daylight, as if the town itself smiled. She knew deep down, this was where they're meant to be. As our little village spread wider each season, it became clear that we could no longer rely on neighbors alone to keep order. We needed a full-time officer. Word of our search drifted farther than we ever expected, all the way to Chicago, where Officer Benjamin Jolly heard of us while on patrol beside Officer Robert Peel. Chicago was a city of noise and smoke, of endless clatter and restless ambition. Its police force, still finding its footing, mirrored the city's own growing pains. Jolly, no longer a young man, yet not old enough to hang up his badge, felt the years in his stride. He had served faithfully, but the clang and chaos had worn him thin. When word reached him of a quiet village in upstate New York seeking a man to keep the peace, he thought, perhaps this is where I'm meant to finish my service. As Officer Jolly tells us his story, by mid-September, with snow heavy upon the ground, he and the family, Hilda, George, Georgina, Olive, and Cora, packed the wagon, secured the oxen, and set out eastward. The journey was merciless, winds that sliced like knives, snow so deep it swallowed the trail whole. At night, under coarse wool blankets, he would imagine the life ahead. Wooden homes nestled by the hills, smoke curling from chimneys, neighbors who knew one another by name. Weeks became months. The winter refused to break. Yet Jolly pressed on, his oxen trudging faithfully through the white wilderness. And then, one late February morning, he crested the final ridge and saw James's village below, a cluster of roofs and lamplight gleaming like a lantern in the dark, and Harold and I were there to greet them, standing on the porch of the country's best bed and breakfast, our boots crunching in the snow. The lanterns along the railing flickered in the wind, casting a warm glow across the fresh drifts that blanketed Pleasant Street. Officer Benjamin Jolly climbed down from his wagon, shoulders heavy with the miles but eyes bright with purpose. His face was lined by wind and frost, the kind of weathered determination earned only through long service and a harder journey. We shook his hand, and in that moment we knew the village had gained more than an officer. We had gained a guardian, a man whose road through hardship had prepared him for the quiet strength our home required. Behind him came two children, George and Georgina, climbing down carefully from the wagon seat. Teenagers by height, but bundled so thickly they looked no more than 6 or 8. They stood close together, clutching their small travel bags. Their cheeks were red from the cold, their breath rising in little clouds as they took in the view of our snow-covered village. The great clock tower chimed in the distance, a soft, steady sound that made both children turn their heads in wonder. Jolly let out a weary chuckle as he brushed the snow from his coat. "This adventure," he said, nodding back toward the wagon, the oxen, and the trail nearly swallowed by winter behind them, "is something you'd read about on the Oregon Trail." Harold helped Georgina down the last step, steadying her mittened hand while I gathered George's bag before he could protest. Their boots sank deep into the snow as they stepped forward, and the children stared around as though they'd stepped into a storybook. Lanterns glowing, smoke curling from cottage chimneys, and garlands twinkling along Pleasant Street. "Welcome home," I told them, and I meant it. Jolly looked at his children, then at our village, and something softened in his eyes. Relief, gratitude, maybe even hope. After miles of cold and danger, hardship, and quiet determination, he had finally reached a place built for peace. And that night, James's village gained not just an officer, but a family. That very evening, as snow fell thick across Shay's frozen park, Officer Jolly walked the paths with his lantern in hand. A few children lingered near their sleds, their laughter echoing through the cold. He smiled and said gently, "Don't worry, the snow may blanket the park. But you're safe here. Even on Christmas Eve, someone's always keeping watch." The children giggled and ran home, cheeks pink, hearts lightened by the sound of his boots behind them. Their parents, waiting on porches strung with garlands and candlelight, nodded in quiet thanks as Jolly passed, his lantern steady, his step unbroken. That Christmas Eve became a night we would never forget. Families gathered in the square beneath the falling snow, carols carried on the wind, and at the edge of it all stood Officer Jolly, tall, calm, dusted in white, his lantern lifted high. For the first time, our little village felt the peace of being truly watched over. In the seasons that followed, his words became a kind of blessing. When storms rolled in or nights grew long, someone would smile and whisper, "Don't worry. Even on Christmas Eve, someone's keeping watch." I cannot tell the story of James's village without pausing to remember Ronald Bauer and Susan Keller, just 19 and 18 years old. They were among the very first to step foot here, carrying with them nothing more than a satchel of belongings, their courage, and a hope strong enough to cross an ocean. Ronald came from a long line of farmers in southern Germany, though by his time there was no land left for him to till. His hands knew the feel of soil even before they knew how to write his name. Susan's people were vintners along the Rhine, her childhood shaped by grape harvests, ripening barrels, and the warm chatter of cellar work. Yet both families faced the same tightening struggle, Germany's political unrest after failed revolutions, farmland stretched thin, and old social pressures closing in on young dreamers. Together, they chose America. Their journey across the Atlantic was no gentle passage. The decks were crowded, the food scarce, and storms slammed the vessel so often the lanterns swung like wild pendulums. At night, the creaking wood and roaring waves drowned out all hope of sleep. But Ronald and Susan held fast to each other, whispering promises of the life they would build if they could just survive the passage. When at last they reached New York, the harbor struck them like another world entirely. Sails clustered as thick as winter branches, smoke from steamships curling into the gray morning sky, and voices swirling in a dozen languages neither of them had ever heard. They followed word of new land farther and farther inland until they came to a place still raw, unshaped, and waiting. James's village. It was here, in those earliest days when the roads were mud and the tree stumps still fresh, that they planted their very first roots. Harold, Ronald, and a handful of our earliest settlers built the first farmhouse, hauling rough boards across the clearing, straightening bent nails on flat stones, and working long into the fading light until lantern flames flickered against the fresh-cut beams. I still remember Ronald humming under his breath as he worked, a tune his father had taught him, something steady and comforting that kept the cold at bay. Harold and I wanted Ronald and Susan to have the farm they had been denied back home, a place where soil was plentiful instead of scarce, where a young couple could look at open land and see a future instead of a wall. And so, on this wide stretch of New York earth, Ronald finally had what he had crossed an ocean dreaming of. Acres of untouched ground waiting for seed, room enough to raise a family, and a chance to begin the farm life he had always longed for. Susan soon tended a small garden that grew in stubborn defiance of the stony ground. Her laughter often drifted through the open windows in summer, bright as the tin wind chimes she hung by the door. On cold evenings, the scent of her freshly poured candles, lavender, pine, sometimes honey, traveled all the way down Pleasant Street, guiding neighbors like a warm beacon. To this day, I can still picture her standing in her apron with flour on her cheek, waving to passers-by as the first snow of the season began to fall. And if you listen closely, on a still December night, when the lights of Shay's frozen park shimmer against the frost, you might swear you can hear Ronald's old German lullaby weaving faintly through the trees, a tender echo of the life they built here. This Christmas Eve, Ronald and Susan will become Mr. and Mrs. Bauer, a quiet reminder that love, courage, and a little stubborn hope are what built this village from the ground up. The Snowfield family came to James's village at a time when hope was needed most. Dr. Ambrose Snowfield, tall and steady with his weathered leather briefcase in hand, carried the quiet authority of a man who had seen sickness and was not afraid to face it. His wife, Athena, a nurse, walked beside him with gentle grace, her presence soft but strong, the kind of woman whose very touch promised comfort. Their son Silas, 9 years old and curious-eyed, clutched his mother's hand but craned his neck at every new sight, eager to take in the village that would now be their home. The Snowfields had left Germany behind, a land where hardship, political unrest, and waves of illness wore down even the strongest of families. They sought more than survival, they sought purpose. When word spread through travelers and tradesmen that Harold and Ivy Shay Mullins were searching desperately for a doctor, Ambrose felt the call. America offered opportunity, but James's village offered need. When they finally arrived one crisp winter evening, the entire settlement seemed to stir. Women leaned from porches, children peeked shyly from behind their mothers' skirts, and men tipped their caps as the family passed. A few whispered, "That must be the doctor. Look at his case." Others watched Athena, noting the calm way she carried herself, as if she already belonged among them. At the front of the crowd stood Harold and I. Ambrose extended his hand, and Harold gripped it with the firm relief of a man who had been waiting far too long. Athena was greeted with an embrace from me, who welcomed her not as a stranger, but as a sister. Together, the Mullins led them up the snowy lane to the country's best bed and breakfast, where warm fires, food, and soft beds waited. That night, the villagers finally breathed easier. They had a doctor and nurse at last. The need soon proved itself. With the nearest hospital 40 miles away and winter roads often impassable, illness was an unwelcome but constant neighbor. Influenza, diphtheria, and tuberculosis stalked every home. As the Great War in Europe finally ended, another enemy swept the globe, the influenza pandemic. While bells rang out in distant cities celebrating peace, James's village huddled in fear as the sickness spread. Families whispered around their stoves, terrified that the cough claiming neighbors overnight would soon find its way to their own door. It was then that Ambrose and Athena became the lifeline of James's village. Ambrose trudged house to house through snowdrifts, lantern casting a golden glow ahead of him, his leather briefcase always at his side. Behind the windows of their home, Athena could be seen working by lamplight. She boiled herbs and linens through the night, steam clouding the glass, while the sharp scents of menthol, thyme, and rosemary drifted into the street. She pressed cool cloths to fevered brows, spooned broth past parched lips, and whispered words of comfort where medicine alone could not reach. Even young Silas lent his hands, fetching water, stoking the fire, carrying wood, and running messages through the snow when his father needed urgent help. Though only 14, he grew quickly into his role as the doctor's son, watching, learning, and carrying responsibility beyond his years. Though influenza left sorrow in its wake, the village endured, and when Athena later gave birth to Henrietta, the very first child born in James's village, her tiny cry carried through the night air. To the weary villagers, it was more than the sound of a newborn. It was a promise. Life had begun anew, even in the shadow of fear. Orville and Wilma Chestnut did not come to America for adventure. They came because remaining where they were meant losing everything. They were originally from a small fishing port along the western coast of Ireland, a place where salt clung to every window, and the wind carried stories of storms long before they arrived. Orville had been a lighthouse keeper's apprentice, tending the lamps, polishing the lenses, and helping guide boats through fog thick enough to swallow a man whole. Wilma, gentle but firm, worked alongside her mother in the village weaving hall, spinning wool into blankets that warmed half the coast. Then came the winter that changed everything. A brutal storm shattered their shoreline, taking boats, homes, and nearly their livelihood with it. The lighthouse where Orville trained was damaged so badly it would take years to rebuild. Fishermen scattered, families left, and the weaving hall shut its doors. One by one, the future they had imagined slipped through their fingers. So when the parish posted notices about ships bound for America, land of steady work and fresh beginnings, Orville and Wilma knew they could not raise a family on ruins. They packed what little they owned, wrapped newborn Harvey in a wool blanket Wilma had woven herself, and boarded a ship toward a place they had only heard in prayers and rumors. America was loud and strange, but it gave them something Ireland no longer could: a chance. They settled first in Boston, where Orville worked long hours hauling cargo at the docks, while Wilma stitched hems and mended coats for sailors. But Boston was crowded, expensive, and fast. Too fast. Harvey needed space. Their turning point came through something small. A letter. A sailor Orville had once helped guide through a storm wrote to them from upstate New York. He had passed through a young settlement called James's Village, where a couple named Harold and Ivy Shay Mullins were building something rare. A place of hospitality, opportunity, and dignity. A place that needed good families. A place where children grew up under trees rather than chimneys. The letter said, "Come. They need hands and hearts. And you need a home." So the Chestnuts went. They arrived in James's Village dusty from travel, but filled with a hope they hadn't felt since Ireland. Harold and I greeted them on the steps of the bed and breakfast, surprised to see a young couple carrying themselves with the quiet strength of people who had survived storms, both real and unseen. Orville soon found his calling as the village clockmaker and repairman. He had always worked with precision: lenses, lamps, gears, tides. And now he kept every watch, mantel clock, and street lantern in perfect order. It was Orville who maintained the inner workings of the great clock tower overlooking Shay's frozen park, tending it like a living heartbeat for the entire village. Wilma opened a small laundering and pressing shop, her hands skilled and steady from years of weaving. She washed linens for the bed and breakfast, pressed uniforms for the men returning from service, and stitched tiers and dresses so finely that no one could tell where the fabric had ever been broken. They fit into the village so naturally, it seemed as though they had always been meant to find us. As though one storm in Ireland had set them on a path toward a lantern-lit street in New York, toward safety, toward purpose, toward a quiet life built not from loss, but from renewal. And every Christmas Eve, when the great clock in the park struck 6, Orville Chestnut would stand back, listening to its bell ring warm and clear across the snow, grateful for the moment that had led them here. While deployed in Vietnam together, William Aldridge, Theodore Timely, Arnold Ashford, and Thomas Mulder, the nights often stretched long and heavy. During those long stretches between orders, when darkness settled over the jungle and home felt impossibly far away, William would speak quietly to Thomas about the new settlement Harold and I were building in New York. He told Thomas about fresh land waiting to be shaped, about work enough for any man willing to give his strength, and about a home where families could begin again. He even spoke proudly of how his wife, Glenda, and her 2 sisters had already settled into our village and found their footing among the earliest families. Thomas listened, hope sparking in him like a match struck against stone. Through letters sent across oceans, he convinced his wife, Beatrice Hamilton Mulder, to pack up every belonging and head east to James's Village. Beatrice didn't hesitate, not when she heard that familiar mixture of exhaustion and determination in her husband's words. And, as always, her 2 sisters, Tessa Timely and Anne Ashford, were not far behind. But war changes everything. Not long after Beatrice and her sisters arrived, Thomas received a Purple Heart, and William lost his life to the war. His death reached our village like a cold wind, for William had been one of the first to believe in what Harold and I were building. As soon as Thomas was well enough to travel, he headed straight for James's Village, the very place William had spoken of with such pride. The place where Thomas's family waited, and the place where the memory of William Aldridge lived quietly in every hopeful corner of our growing home. Tessa soon found her calling in the heart of the community, becoming the village's very first schoolteacher. Though she and Theodore never had children of their own, she quickly became Aunt Tessa to every child in James's village, beloved, patient, and always ready with a kind word or a peppermint candy tucked in her apron pocket. As for Theodore Timely, he remains deployed overseas in the Vietnam War. Each evening, Tessa can be found at her cottage window, hair pinned just right, her dress pressed to perfection. Because, as she often tells me with that hopeful sparkle in her eye, you never know when Theodore might come walking up that hill. And that, my dear visitors, is the kind of love and devotion that keeps James's village glowing, brighter than any Christmas light could ever shine. Anne Ashford was the last of the 3 Hamilton sisters to arrive in James's village. Her husband, Arnold, is serving overseas in Vietnam alongside Theodore, and the weight of that absence followed her all the way here. I remember how hard those first weeks were for her. Anne had always been a stay-at-home mother, pouring her whole heart into raising their 4 little ones. Uprooting her life and traveling across the country without Arnold's steady presence was no small thing. But once our little schoolhouse was finally finished, and with Tessa teaching inside those fresh-painted walls, Anne found her footing again. Knowing her children spent their days learning, laughing, and safe beside their cousins gave her a kind of peace she had long been holding her breath for. With her home a touch quieter during the day, Anne picked up work at the country's best bed and breakfast. She tends to each room the way she cares for people, softly, attentively, with a kindness that lingers long after she's gone. She once told me it makes her feel a little closer to home, keeping things warm, clean, and welcoming for travelers just as she would for her own family. I'm reminded that even in the hardest seasons, love has a way of gathering itself, standing back up, and finding its way home again, sometimes right here in our little village. My sister Frankie's letter arrived. She's going to be coming to my village for the first time this year. This will be the first time seeing her since the passing of our father, James Paul Getty. A little about Francesca, born to Paul and Lavinia Getty, and my younger sister and heiress to the Getty oil fortune. Francesca Frankie Getty Doyle sits atop a staggering net worth of more than $107.8 billion, give or take a few billion, the kind of money where she could wrap the entire North Pole in $100 bills not once, but twice, and never even notice it missing. After Frankie received her inheritance from Getty's Oil, she didn't hesitate. She packed her bags, kissed California goodbye, and caught the first ship that could carry her toward a life that felt big enough for her dreams. Honolulu, Hawaii became her world, warm, glittering, distant. That was many years ago, and from the moment she left, we hadn't seen her since. Frankie married at 32 to a real estate developer named Ronald Brickman. He had promised her the world, or at least a Times Square billboard with her name blazing across it. But their fairy tale flickered fast. After just 64 days, the court ended the marriage with a tidy phrase: irreconcilable ambition. 4 years later, at 38, Frankie married again, this time to Frank Doyle, a young banker she had mistaken for a sommelier at a Monaco gala. 2 years into their seemingly charmed life, she gave birth to their only child, a sweet little boy named Chester. But tragedy has never cared about money or glamour. During a family trip to the Swiss Alps, Chester fell suddenly, devastatingly ill, and at just 4 years old, he passed away. A loss like that sends cracks through even the strongest hearts. Frankie was never quite the same. Her marriage to Frank lasted 5 more years, unraveling quietly, thread by thread. By the next December, Frank had moved out altogether, and rumor has it, he now lives somewhere right here in James's village. The morning of the Christmas Eve party, a familiar hush hung over the country's best bed and breakfast. Snowflakes whispered against the windows, and Glenda Aldridge, dutiful as ever, was finishing the morning books at the front desk when the bell above the door chimed softly. A woman stepped inside. Graceful, careful, wrapped in a long wool coat the color of faded midnight. Glenda straightened. A historical face had arrived. Rose Dawson. Rumors had preceded her like a cold wind. The mysterious widow from California, who lived quietly on the coast, the woman whose past was said to be draped in whispers and tragedy. Some said she had been lost at sea. Others claimed she'd changed her name, vanished into open land, and never looked back. Only Glenda had the privilege of seeing her now, not just because of who she was, but because of who she used to be, Rose DeWitt Bouquetier. Once, her name carried weight in drawing rooms lined with mahogany and oil portraits. She had come from a world of silk gloves and afternoon tea, of opera balconies and suffocating expectations. Her mother had raised her for one purpose: to marry into money large enough to rescue their fading fortune. But wealth, she had learned, could be a cage painted gold, and love, true love, had come from the opposite end of the ship. Jack. Her Jack. The boy from steerage with eyes like open sky. He had saved her, not just from drowning in icy water, but from drowning in a life never meant for her. He had given her courage, fire, laughter. She had given him everything she had left. Her trust, her heart, her soul, all in one fragile night they both knew time would steal. Even now, decades later, the memory hit her like a wave. She blinked hard, the kind of tears age can salt but never soften. After the Titanic, she had run from the world that claimed to know her. California had become her refuge. There, she raised horses under the morning sun. She lived quietly, fiercely independent, with a new name and a new spine forged from heartbreak. She married, had children, built her own modest fortune, not with diamonds, but with labor, grit, and a heart that refused to quit. Her children only learned the truth long after they were grown, long after the world believed Rose DeWitt Bouquetier was gone forever. It suited her. Solitude held her gently, and yet something about James's village had called to her, perhaps the promise of peace, or the way my home radiated warmth through the cold. Rose's fingers brushed the frost from her gloves as she looked around the lobby. She carried herself with a quiet elegance, the kind born not from breeding, but from surviving. Every line on her face told a story. Glenda couldn't speak for a moment. Then Rose smiled, soft, knowing, touched by memory. "You jump. I jump, right?" she whispered to herself, a sad smile tugging at her lips. Glenda heard the words, but did not intrude. She simply nodded respectfully, sensing she was standing in the presence of a living story, a woman who had loved deeply, lost profoundly, and somehow, against all odds, lived on. And so, on the morning of the Christmas Eve party, Rose Dawson, Titanic's once-lost girl, checked into the county's best bed and breakfast, a ghost of history, stepping gently into the heart of James's village. This year, Harold and I decided to throw the yearly Christmas bash down at Shay's Frozen Park, on the corner of Pleasant Street and Central Park. On Christmas Eve, lanterns glowed against the frost, garlands sparkled in the starlight, and the whole village gathered with us. But this night was not just our Christmas Eve party. It was also Ronald and Susan's wedding, set right there in the middle of the park. The scene was alive with color and warmth. Melinda, dressed in a blingy sparkle glitter maroon fluffy dress, rocked a pram with baby Henry bundled inside, his little face peeking from the blankets. Beside her, the twins sitting on the park bench, Glenda, shimmering in her velvet green gown, and Brenda, glowing in blue. The three sisters, Melinda, Glenda, and Brenda, shared a closeness that needed no words, their bond as steady as the snow beneath their feet. And then, from the side of Central Park, a hush seemed to follow four figures who stepped out from the swirling snow. They were the sisters who had made a vow among themselves long ago, to always be ready, always be radiant, just in case their soldiers returned. Beatrice, Anne, and Tessa Harrington appeared in perfect white, their gowns gleaming like frost under the lantern glow. They carried themselves with a quiet dignity, as though each sequin, each strand of lace, was an unspoken promise to the men still far from home. Children raced across the snow in front of them, tossing snowballs, shrieking laughter that melted into the air, while the sisters moved together with graceful patience. The snowflakes fell lightly into their hair, but they never faltered, never let the chill or the waiting undo their poise. And behind them, as though stepping straight from a dream, came Thomas Mulder, the sharpshooter Purple Heart, Bernice's husband, his soldier's uniform pressed and sharp, boots crunching on the frosted path. His presence carried weight. One soldier among so many who had not yet come home, a living reminder of hope kept alive in every stitch of the sisters' gowns. Orville, Wilma, and Harvey are entering the park, Wilma in that beautiful Christmas green dress with gold sequins. The Myers were doing the caroling tonight in their awful, out-of-tune, non-sequence voices. It sounded less like harmony and more like a contest to see who could sing the loudest, each one charging over the other in a jumble of mismatched notes. Rose, of course, had dressed to steal the show in her striking red gown, that ridiculous heart-of-the-ocean necklace glittering at her throat, worth more than the entire village, though no one dared say it aloud. Chelsea, in pale blue, tried to keep tempo while rocking Tommy, the 82-year-old baby, as though her gentle sway might steady the chaos while carrying her basket of bread. Still, no one dared stop the Myers, because in their own way, their terrible singing had become part of the tradition. Francesca Frankie Doyle, yes, didn't lie, here she is, making her grand appearance. Frankie doesn't stroll into a holiday display. She descends. She flew in all the way from Honolulu just to see the village Harold and I built in our father's memory. And Frankie Getty Doyle doesn't come in quietly, or normally. She doesn't just take a plane. Oh no. Frankie arrives only by private jet, gliding at 30,000 feet while sipping imported mineral water and critiquing the color of the snow from above as if she's never actually touched it. When her Louis Vuitton 6-inch gold glitzy heels hit the cobblestones, the click echoed through the park like a firework in church, followed immediately by a sharp yelp when she slipped on a patch of ice. And if the heels weren't dramatic enough, the sound she made was exactly what you'd hear if you accidentally stepped on a dog's tail. Everything stopped. Everyone stared. Even the Myers, mid-carol, mid-screech, froze and craned their necks toward Central Park. And there she was, Frankie being lifted gracefully and unnecessarily by 3 bodyguards. As if anyone in James's village, population maybe 1,500 on a busy year, was going to cause her trouble. Frankie has always believed in giving the wow factor every single time she's seen, and truly, most folks here had only ever spotted her in the newspaper. She was wearing what could only be described as something created on purpose, a Christian Dior, or perhaps aggressively Diorish, leopard print jacket trimmed in feathers. Yes, feathers. Matching bell-bottoms swished with each confident, mildly disapproving step. A matching leopard print hat perched atop her perfectly styled hair, loud, bold, and absolutely Frankie. And underneath, she wore a shiny, gleaming gold top that caught every light in the park, paired with a matching gold belt lined with massive diamonds, the kind of diamonds that could pay off the village bakery, the clock tower repairs, and half the street lamps in one go. And those sunglasses, oversized, mysterious, and absolutely unnecessary after sunset, stayed firmly on her face because Frankie didn't come to James's village to blend in. She came to be seen. Officer Benjamin Jolly stood steady at the driveway near the lamppost, his uniform sharp, his presence a watchful anchor among the revelry. George and Georgina circled the ice rink, practicing the lift they'd been working on for weeks. In the very moment George steadied his grip and Georgina began to rise, laughter on her lips, determination in her eyes, the park froze. The snowflakes halted mid-fall, the lantern light paused in its glow, and the two of them remained captured forever in that almost perfect lift, suspended in the magic of the moment. Margaret dazzled in a gold glittering gown, holding baby Ariel close, with Naomi standing proudly beside them, their family shining like stars under the holiday lights and twinkling displays. Out in front, you have Ambrose, Athena in yellow, Silas, and 60-year-old Henrietta. Ron appeared in his fine green suit, and Susan shone in her ivory dress, her veil trailing like spun sugar in the winter air. Off to the side in the park, Diana in her striking coral dress drew every eye as they cradled 94-year-old baby Ida Rose. Her laughter rang out like silver bells, soaring above the off-key voices of the Myers family, until the whole gathering seemed to pause and smile in her direction. Rosemary and Elmer, standing proudly next to Ron and Susan. That was when Harold and I arrived. He in a lavender suit, embroidered with gold lace, his arms steady and proud beside me. I wore my deep purple dress with a light lavender fur coat draped across my shoulders, the cold air biting but unable to pierce the warmth of the fabric. My black and purple heels clicked softly against the frozen path, each step echoing in the hush that fell as we entered Shay's frozen park. The great clock stood tall at the heart of the park, its frosted face gleaming under the winter moon. Its hand crept closer to the hour, the steady tick carrying across the frozen air. All around it, our neighbors, the people of James's village, had gathered, their laughter dimming as they turned their faces toward us. For that moment, it felt as though the whole village itself had fallen silent, their eyes catching the shimmer of gold lace and the deep purple sequins of my dress, as if a hidden spotlight had chosen us. Harold glanced down at me, a faint smile curving his lips, and I caught the glint of gold thread catching in the light as he moved. Side by side, we must have looked like something stitched out of the same cloth, lavender and purple blending into one, like two notes of the same chord struck together. I leaned just slightly into him, hearing the crunch of the frozen path beneath our steps, the murmur of anticipation surrounding us, and knew the night was ours to walk into. The great clock tower tolled, once, twice, 3 times, and then again until the long toll for midnight. And then it happened. The Myers carols faltered, their off-key voices breaking mid-note, laughter dissolved, and the air itself turned to ice. Brenda and Glenda upon the bench, Frank at their shoulders, Melinda with baby Henry, Francesca, Rose, Chelsea, Officer Jolly, George and Georgina, Margaret with Ariel and Naomi close, Ron and Susan, Elmer and Rosemary, Diana cradling Ida Rose, Tessa, Beatrice, and Anne in their white gowns, and Thomas Mulder in his uniform, all stilled. No longer guests, no longer living characters, each figure stilled, each soul sealed, forever mannequins of Shay's frozen park. Ron leaned toward Susan, his hand brushing hers. It should have been their first kiss as husband and wife, but it will never happen now. They are statues beneath the wedding arch, lips forever parted, caught in a moment that time has locked away. Harold and I stood among them, not moving, not speaking. We too were part of it, bound into the frozen tale. No one knew our secret, that we had already sold the land. Alice Wilton had made her offer, and we had accepted. We bought the land, built the land, owned the land, and then we passed it on. Now the story belongs to her. The village, locked frozen in time, will remain here always and forever. Whether Alice dares to begin a part 2, that is for her alone. And that is our story, the story of a Christmas walk in the park on Pleasant Street. Every visitor, every glance, every smile has breathed life into this little village of ours. Thank you for stepping into our world tonight. May the warmth you felt here follow you home, and may you remember that even the smallest lights can make the longest winter feel bright. I wish you a Merry Christmas and a beautiful holiday season.